You know, most of us go through life thinking we understand the concept of God. We hear stories, read scriptures, go to places of worship, and feel like we've got a decent grasp of what's going on. But here's the thing, the top 1%, the ones who really know, they understand something that most of us don't. They see God in a completely different way. And this secret, once you hear it, might just change everything for you. I'm not talking about some mystery hidden in ancient texts or a puzzle that needs to be solved. I'm talking about something so obvious that, once you see it, you'll wonder how you've missed it your whole life. It's not about having more faith or doing more rituals. The secret that the top 1% know is much deeper and simpler than that, but it requires us to look at God without all the filters we've been given since birth.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound spiritual lessons.
So here's the question, what if everything you've been told about God was just a starting point? What if there's something beyond all the teachings, beyond all the stories, and that something is what the top 1% have tapped into? The real God isn't confined to the images we've been fed, the rules we've been taught to follow, or the fear we've been conditioned to feel. The top 1% know that God is not something external, not some being sitting above us, watching and judging. The real God is beyond all that, and once you understand this, you begin to see everything differently. Think about it. If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and present everywhere, then why would God care about the small, trivial stuff we obsess over? Why would God be limited by human emotions like anger or jealousy when God is supposed to be infinite? The truth is, the top 1% understand that God isn't worried about what we do as much as we think. God is more concerned with how we perceive reality itself. You see, God is not a person, a figure, or even a force. God is the very essence of existence. The top 1% realize that God is in everything and is everything. There's no separation between you and God, between the universe and God. This isn't some philosophical idea, this is the reality they live in every day. And once you see this, you'll realize that life isn't about pleasing some external deity or following strict guidelines. Life is about aligning yourself with the true nature of existence, which is God. But here's the part that blows people's minds. The top 1% don't just believe in God. They experience God directly. And experiencing God isn't about some mystical vision or a voice from the sky. It's about realizing that everything around you, including yourself, is a manifestation of the divine. It's about seeing that the same force that makes the sun rise and the stars shine is the same force that makes you breathe, think, and feel. I know this might sound abstract, but let me ask you something. When was the last time you really felt connected to something bigger than yourself? Not in a moment of prayer or meditation, but in everyday life? What if that feeling of connection wasn't rare or hard to achieve, but always available, right in front of you? The top 1% live in that state all the time, because they've realized that the real God is not a distant being, but the very fabric of reality itself. Now, let's get deeper. The top 1% understand something that most people miss, and it's right at the core of this secret. The real God isn't found in the loud, obvious places. The real God is found in the spaces between. Between what? Between everything. Between your thoughts, between your breaths, between your actions. That's where God is. And it's in those spaces that the top 1% have learned to tap into the divine. You see, most of us are so caught up in the noise of life, in the constant chatter of our minds, that we miss the silence where God really exists. We think, we plan, we worry, and we forget that the real power, the real God, isn't in the noise, but in the silence that holds everything together. The top 1% know how to access that silence and how to live from that place of stillness. Think about it like this: when you're listening to music, it's not just the notes that matter. It's the space between the notes that gives the music its rhythm, its depth, its meaning. Without those spaces, it would just be noise. Life is the same way. The real God is in the silence, the space between all the things we think are important. And in that silence, the top 1% have found the truth about the divine. So how do we access that? It's not as hard as you might think. The first step is to stop looking for God in the places you've been taught to look. Stop trying to find God in words, in rules, in concepts. Instead, start paying attention to the spaces between. Pay attention to the moments when your mind is still, when there's no thought, just pure awareness. That's where you'll find the real God. The top 1% don't see God as something separate from themselves. They know that God is the very awareness that's watching their thoughts, their actions, their life unfold. And once you realize that, everything changes. You stop trying to reach for something outside of yourself. You stop trying to earn God's favor because you realize that you and God are not two separate things. You are God experiencing itself right here, right now. This is the real secret. The top 1% live in this awareness all the time. They don't get caught up in the illusions of life. They see the truth that all of this, everything we experience, is just a play of consciousness. And once you see that, you stop taking things so seriously. You stop worrying about the future because you know that the real God is beyond time, beyond space, beyond everything we think is real. But here's the question: are you ready to let go of the old ideas of God and embrace this deeper truth? Are you willing to see that the real God isn't something you can understand with your mind, but something you can only experience in the silence between thoughts? Now let's talk about how you can start living like the top 1%. The real God isn't something you find and then forget about. Once you see the truth, it becomes a part of everything you do. The top 1% don't just know this secret, they live it. And that's what makes all the difference. The first practical step to living with the real God is to start paying attention to your awareness. Every time you catch yourself lost in thought, in emotion, in reaction, take a step back. Notice that there's a part of you that is always watching, always present. That part of you is God. It's not something outside of you, it's the very essence of who you are. The top 1% know that this awareness is the key to everything. It's not about controlling your mind or your life. It's about realizing that the real power comes from the awareness behind the mind. Once you start living from that place of awareness, everything changes. You stop reacting to life, and you start creating it. And here's the beautiful part: the more you live from this awareness, the more you start to see the divine in everything. You start to realize that every person you meet, every experience you have, is a reflection of the real God. You stop seeing the world as separate from you, and you start seeing it as an extension of your own consciousness. The top 1% live in a state of constant connection to the divine, not because they're special, but because they've realized that the real God is not something to be found. It's something to be remembered. It's something that has always been there, waiting for you to notice it. So here's the final question: are you ready to stop searching for God and start living with the real God, right here, right now? Are you ready to stop searching for God and start living with the real God right here, right now? Because here's the truth that the top 1% know: God isn't hiding. God is right in front of you, within you, in every single moment. But most people are too distracted, too lost in their minds to see it. It's not that God is keeping secrets from us, it's that we've forgotten how to see clearly. What happens when you start living with this awareness? Life becomes a completely different experience. You stop feeling like a separate, isolated individual trying to survive in a chaotic world. Instead, you realize that you are part of a much larger whole, an infinite, interconnected existence. And that's the real God, the God that's not separate from life, but the very essence of life itself. Now, imagine what your life would look like if you started living from this place of expanded awareness. How would your relationships change if you saw the divine in every person you interacted with? How would your work change if you approached it from the understanding that you are not working for yourself, but as a part of the creative force of the universe? The top 1% understand that every action they take is an expression of the divine. That's why they don't get caught up in the drama of life. They see the bigger picture. But let's get real for a second. It's easy to talk about awareness and consciousness, but how do you actually live this in your everyday life? Here's where the top 1% separate themselves from the rest. They don't just think about these ideas, they put them into practice. And it's not about meditating for hours or retreating from the world. It's about integrating this awareness into every moment of your life. Let me give you an example. You're sitting in traffic, and normally you'd be frustrated, impatient, maybe even angry. But if you're living with the real God, you see that traffic isn't something happening to you. It's just a part of the flow of life. In that moment, you have a choice. Do you get lost in your emotions, or do you step back and see the bigger picture? The top 1% always choose the bigger picture. They know that every moment, no matter how small or insignificant it seems, is an opportunity to experience the divine. And here's another thing: the top 1% understand the real God doesn't play favorites. Life isn't about deserving something or earning blessings. It's about aligning yourself with the flow of the universe. When you resist life, when you try to control everything, you create suffering. But when you trust the flow, when you let go of your need to control, that's when you experience real freedom. That's when you start living with the real God. So how do you start living this way? The first step is to pay attention. Notice when you're getting caught up in your mind, in your emotions, in your reactions. Notice when you're resisting life. And then, in that moment, take a step back. Breathe. Feel the awareness behind the thoughts. That awareness is the real God. And the more you practice this, the more natural it becomes. But here's the thing: this isn't a one-time realization. It's a practice. The top 1% didn't just wake up one day and suddenly live in perfect alignment with the divine. They practiced. They made mistakes. They fell back into old patterns, but they kept coming back to the truth. And that's what you need to do too. You're going to have moments where you forget, where you get caught up in the drama of life. That's okay. What matters is that you keep coming back to the awareness, to the real God that's always there, always present. Now let's talk about one of the biggest obstacles to living with the real God: fear. Fear is what keeps most people from experiencing the divine in their everyday lives. Fear of the unknown, fear of losing control, fear of failure. But here's what the top 1% know: fear is just an illusion. It's a trick of the mind. The real God, the one that the top 1% are connected to, isn't afraid of anything. How could God be afraid when God is everything? When you start living with this awareness, fear begins to lose its power over you. You start to see that the things you were afraid of were never real to begin with. They were just stories your mind was telling you. But let me ask you something. What would your life look like if you weren't afraid? What would you do if you knew, deep down, that you were supported by the infinite intelligence of the universe? The top 1% know this truth, and that's why they don't live in fear. They take risks. They follow their intuition. They live fully, because they know that they are part of something much bigger than themselves. And you can live this way too, but you have to be willing to let go of the fear that's holding you back. The real God isn't about control, judgment, or fear. The real God is about freedom, creativity, and love. And once you understand this, once you start living from this place, everything in your life changes. You start to see that life isn't a struggle. It's not something to be conquered or controlled. Life is a gift, a dance, a play of consciousness. And when you align yourself with the real God, you become a part of that dance. You stop resisting and you start flowing. So here's the final question. Are you ready to live in flow with the real God? Are you ready to let go of the fear, the control, and the old stories that have been holding you back? Because the truth is, the real God has always been with you, waiting for you to notice. And once you do, life becomes an entirely different experience. You start living with a sense of peace, joy, and freedom that most people can only dream of. That's the secret the top 1% know. They don't just believe in God, they live with God every single day. And now you can too. When you live with God, not as an idea or a distant concept, but as an ever-present reality, the way you experience life fundamentally shifts. The questions that once haunted you about your purpose, your worth, your fate start to dissolve. Why? Because you realize that these questions were born from a misunderstanding of who you really are. The top 1% know something that most people don't. They understand that the real God is not something external that you need to reach out to or seek approval from. The real God is the source of your being, the very essence of consciousness that is experiencing life through you. And when you live with this understanding, everything you do becomes an expression of that divine consciousness. But let me ask you this: what would happen if you stopped seeing yourself as separate from God? How would your decisions change? Would you still hold on to the same fears, the same doubts, the same limitations that you've been carrying for years? The top 1% don't live with those limitations because they've realized that those limitations are self-imposed. They come from identifying with the small self, the ego, rather than the infinite consciousness that is the real God. Here's the thing: the top 1% don't just talk about this, they live it. They understand that the real God doesn't want you to worship from a place of fear or lack. The real God wants you to embody the divine, to express it in everything you do. And once you start living this way, you begin to see that life is not a series of random events happening to you. Life is a reflection of your own consciousness, and the more you align with the divine within, the more your external reality begins to shift. This is where most people get stuck. We're conditioned to believe that we are separate from God, that we need to earn God's favor or follow certain rules to be worthy. But the top 1% know that the real God doesn't operate that way. The real God is not some distant being keeping score. The real God is the pure awareness that has been with you since the moment you were born and will be with you long after your physical body is gone. So here's the challenge: can you let go of the old stories you've been told about God? Can you release the need to control everything and trust that there is a higher intelligence guiding your path? The top 1% know that control is an illusion. They've learned to trust the flow of life because they understand that the real God is that flow. They know that when they align themselves with the divine, they are always supported, even when things don't go as planned. Think about the moments in your life that felt the most magical, the most effortless. Maybe it was a time when everything just seemed to fall into place, or when you felt a deep sense of peace for no apparent reason. The top 1% live in that state as much as possible because they've realized that this is their natural state. It's the state of being in harmony with the real God, with the infinite intelligence that governs the universe. But let's be real. This isn't always easy. We live in a world full of distractions, full of noise, full of ego-driven desires. It's easy to get pulled back into the mindset of separation, to believe that you are alone and that life is a struggle. But the top 1% have mastered the art of remembering the truth. They've trained their minds to return again and again to the awareness of the real God that is always present, no matter what is happening externally. And this is the key: it's not about what's happening in the world around you. It's about what's happening inside you. You can live in the most chaotic environment, surrounded by challenges and difficulties, and still be at peace if you are connected to the real God within. The top 1% know this, and that's why they are able to thrive no matter what life throws at them. They've learned to stop looking for God in the external world, and instead they've turned inward. They've realized that the real God is not something that can be found outside of themselves. It can only be experienced within. Now, let me ask you this: how often do you take the time to connect with the divine within? Not through prayer, not through rituals, but through pure awareness. The top 1% make this a daily practice. They know that the more they connect with the real God within, the more their lives flow with ease, abundance, and grace. They don't wait for things to get better externally before they find peace. They create peace within themselves, and then they watch as their external reality begins to mirror that inner state. This is the real secret. The top 1% don't live extraordinary lives because they're lucky or because they've been chosen by God. They live extraordinary lives because they've realized that they are God in human form, just like you are. And once you start living from that place of divine awareness, everything in your life begins to shift. People often ask, how do I manifest the life I want? How do I create abundance, joy, and fulfillment? The answer is simple: stop trying to manifest from the small self. Stop trying to create from a place of lack, fear, or need. Instead, align yourself with the real God, the infinite consciousness that is always present within you. When you live from that place, you don't need to try to manifest anything. Life naturally begins to reflect the divine awareness that you are embodying. So, here's the final question: are you ready to stop playing small? Are you ready to stop living from the limited perspective of the ego and start living from the infinite perspective of the real God? Because the truth is, you've always had the power to live this way. The top 1% aren't special. They've just remembered something that most people have forgotten: that the real God isn't out there somewhere, waiting to be found. The real God is within you, waiting to be lived. And once you start living this truth, there's no going back. Your life will begin to unfold in ways you never imagined, You'll start to experience a level of peace, joy, and fulfillment that most people only dream of. And you'll realize that the secret the top 1% know isn't really a secret at all. It's the truth that has been with you all along, waiting for you to wake up to it. Now, the only question that remains is, will you wake up? Will you remember who you really are? Will you live with the real God, not as a distant being, but as the very essence of your own consciousness? The choice is yours, and the time is now.